we all agree that climate change is not a one only entity organization responsibility. So in your experience, to what extent we have a cross-sector collaboration, cross-organization collaboration, collaborative leadership that breaks across the silos to bring us all together to a common vision, to a common plan, where we really agree on what needs to be done. So what's your experience? What would you say on this cross-sector collaboration on climate change?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and also thank you for very, very good starting points here. So difficult to just continue, but cross-sector, I think Ralph already mentioned it. It's very easy to talk about and very difficult to materialize. Having the privilege of now being coordinating between the 53 national societies that we have, Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in Europe and Central Asia, I start to see the complexity and the scale that we need to work at, not only within the Red Cross societies, but also with other sectors. And when we talk about, for example, anticipatory action, when we talk about climate change, it's something that we've had like a Center for Climate Change within the IFRC for the last 20 years. We've had a hub for anticipatory action in Germany for the last, I think, 10 years maybe. And we really tested a lot of this, but my conclusion as a leader is that we are not good enough still to break these barriers. I mean, we do use data from all the weather institutes. We do collaborate with universities. We do get funding and a little bit of partnering with the private sector. But I don't think that we have realized the scale that we need to take to make this work so that we are properly prepared. And as you may know, I mean, a Red Cross or Red Crescent Society is not an NGO. We are working directly with the government, which I think is a big opportunity in itself. We are working with the municipality office, we are working with the governor's office in the region, and we are working with the national entities. So we have a lot of opportunity, but still I think that we are not good enough at seeing the national and the regional needs and the enormous task that we have ahead of us with the climate change. And just coming back from Turkey, where the earthquake was the purpose of my visit, and I was out visiting these hugely devastated areas. And what happened next? Then we had like the biggest flooding that had happened in a couple of years as well, but that was on top of the earthquake. And I think this is what we have to realize, that one disaster is not necessarily coming alone. It's not coming for one country. It's very often happening across countries. Only a few years ago, we had huge floodings in big parts of Europe. We had a heat wave last summer that was taking a lot of breath from many, many people, and we need to be able to be much better, not only prepared for it, and also not only able to mitigate this, but seriously across sector be having better structures and better plans for how we plan together.
Thank you, Bridget, and I think this goes for all of us, for every actor of the family, every member of the family that works in the humanitarian sector. This kind of cross-sector work to join up better is something, particularly on climate change. It's not at the level where we are, not even the minimum of where we need to be. And of course, I kind of feel like the climate change generation is happening faster than our ability to adapt to it. And that's what we need to accelerate so much more with that. All right, it's my pleasure now to move to our next speaker, Nimo Hassan, who is the director for the NGO Somalia Consortium. Nimo, I would say double welcome, if not triple welcome, because the voice of national actors, it's really vital, it's important. And on every aspect of our work, I would say in particular on climate change, because you have really the institutional history. We arrive in the country and we think we know it all, but actually you are the people who are there. Somalia has gone now through a 6th consecutive season of drought with a dramatic impact that is happening. And it's not just about the water management, it's about food security, agriculture. It has a spillover insecurity. It has spillover on every aspect of life in terms of how we all work. So Nimo, I want to ask you, you coordinate the Somali NGOs, this national amazing capacity that looks into the country. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you have done in Somalia, in particular with relation to climate change and climate adaptation? I mean, this is an issue that is dramatically impacting, among other things, the country. Nimo.
Great, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Panos, and it's a privilege to be here as well, actually. Although I do agree that I'm representing a voice that is lacking in a lot of these global forums and spaces. So the work that Somali NGO Consortium does is actually combining both international and national NGOs in terms of advocacy, representation, and addressing bureaucratic impediments. So it's quite a wide range of activities that we're doing. And with what you said, Panos, that the humanitarian crisis, it's like the people of Somalia never cease to have a good break. It's one crisis after the other: insecurity, COVID, the desert locust you mentioned, as with the Horn of Africa, but also with a protracted crisis that is over 30 years, and its system isn't moving enough to support the communities to be better prepared when crises do hit, including these climate shocks now that are taking place in the whole region, where consecutive 6 failed rain season, people are losing their livelihoods and livestock. 70% of the population is in the rural area, and if you lose your livestock, then literally you have no way of supporting yourself. Now, a lot of the work that the NGOs are doing, particularly the local NGOs and national NGOs, is trying to respond to these crises in many different ways. So the climate adaptation is there, resilience in terms of providing support to rebuild livelihoods. But as we said, breaks are really difficult to come. So even before communities recover, you have another shock that is hitting them. And then combated with insecurity as well. There's a large part of Somalia that is not accessible even to local NGOs sometimes. Now the biggest, challenge and a barrier for local NGOs is resources. In the past couple of years, we talk about localization, but then what does that actually look like on the ground? It's mentioned today in so many number of ways, and we talk about walking the talk, but walking that talk is very, very, very slow. To provide the right resources to the right people at the right time. And as you said, Panos, the national NGOs are the ones who are part and parcel of the community. They're the first responders. They're the ones who will stay long after NGOs and everybody else is left. Yet they are the least. They have the least access to resources for them to be able to do that. So it's a huge challenge, and in forums like this, I think having this type of conversation is really important to ensure that we are supporting the NGOs or the local communities or the elders, or actually involving the community in providing space to give local knowledge, whether it's responding to the climate change or whether it's responding to any other crisis. So I think it's really important that we're doing that. Now, there's a lot of different ways of engagement. We understand that the financing issues can also play a huge role, but also having a better partnerships is what is necessary for us to support and have the communities that we are serving at heart. So they are working, they are trying to respond, but their resources the needs far outweigh the resources. And I think there's more need to invest in the long term. As you just mentioned, the cost equation is much more costly to treat the problem when it's happened, but it's a lot more to prevent it. Now, anticipatory action is really important, but it needs to be financed. You could cry all you want and say the problem is coming, but if there's no response coming, then it doesn't make sense. So I think having anticipatory action in place, but then having the mechanisms to be able to respond when the warnings are hit is also very, very important. I think I'll leave it here for now.
Thanks, Nimo. In fact, actually, many of these crises are almost predictable. There is a cycle. We know when things happen, when they happen, as it happens. And I think this is where preparing and spending money before it is really very cost-effective. I'm now going to move into our next speaker, Michael Kohler, who is the CEO for KONU, a coaching leadership development organization. And together, KONU, together with Dalberg, actually worked with us, with Geli, in terms of supporting the leadership labs in the field, in operations, trying to create innovation, trying to create a thinking space to address systems in 4 countries. So I'll let you explain a little bit further on that, Michael. But my question, and you teach on leadership actually at the Harvard University, and I want to ask you from your field experience, I mean, we talk about leadership here. Is there any particular type of leadership that is needed? Why is it not happening to the level that we want when we try to bring so many actors together to be able to move? So I'm interested because also you bring a fresh perspective into the system in terms of what we do and how we do. Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Panos. So good to meet you and be with you here. I think the question is, what about the climate crisis is a leadership problem? How is that a leadership problem? And I think we intuitively can grasp it, even sort of from the different lenses that we heard from the other panelists. But I think for me, one of the core distinctions is like, in a way you can differentiate problems out there into technical problems that we have the expertise to solve for, where we know how to do it, right? There's a drought. We know how to bring water to people who need water. This may be a very complex operation, but like we can deploy that. But then there's also problems out in the world that we don't know how to address, that require learning, that require innovation, that require boundary crossing, and all of the courage, Kate, that you were talking about. And I think that those are leadership problems. Not leadership problems in the sense of like the people in power need to address them. I mean that in the sense of practicing leadership for everyone involved. The leadership that is required to mobilize new ways of thinking. So in a way, technical problems are problems that can be solved by resources. And there are a lot of technical problems in the humanitarian space. But leadership problems are problems that require new ways of working and require changes of hearts and minds. And I think we can all agree that is required too. We require much more collaboration between the different actors. We require, like the nexus has been a big topic here, and yet what we see is like the different actors in the nexus are not collaborating well. They are, we often talk about the incentives, but I think there's really a cultural challenge around that, a culture in which we have our mandates and in a way collaborative leadership is the type of leadership that goes beyond mandates, where we sometimes even need to turn around to our headquarters and disappoint them and say like, we're not gonna do this, but I'm actually gonna talk with these guys here because we're learning something here on the ground. So that's the kind of leadership we need. So I'll just take another minute to talk about the program that we're doing together because I think this is fascinating. So I think when you're working at the frontier of a challenge, and climate change is kind of a challenge that at every level, individual level, team level, organizational level, global level, we don't know how to address this, right? When my sister sits me down and says like, Michael, what's your piece in the mess? Like this is the moment when we're addressing climate change all the way up to a global level. But we have other areas outside the humanitarian world where people actually know really well how to address a challenge that is at a frontier, and that's science. And that's why I love the word of lab so much, a leadership lab. A lab is a space in which people can experiment, in which they can work a challenge that's on the frontier, in which people can actually also even fail, and where failure is transformed into learning, right? In science, you know, sometimes an experiment fails 300 times, but people learn from it. And so what we're doing in our country labs is we bring the different actors, you know, from the different UN agencies, you know, from your world, from the local NGOs, from the global NGOs, from the international financial institutions, from the government. So all of the actors are in the room, and the idea is everybody holds a piece of the puzzle here, but we don't know how to solve this puzzle yet. And so what we bring, you know, is a facilitated space in which people can learn to see what's getting in the way now that we're together in us solving the puzzle, and people find it out pretty soon, and the donors are in the room as well, and they're realizing, well, you know, each of us is actually contributing to this mess. Now, one of the things that gets in the way the most is not bad intentions. I haven't experienced anybody in the field with bad intentions. The main thing I think that is not talked about is overwhelm. People are really overwhelmed by these challenges, but they're not allowed to name it. Instead, they need to hold it together, they need to be polite, they need to be full of expertise, and then those become what we would call in my world defensive routines, right? So our defensiveness shows up in competence and in politeness and diplomacy. And instead of saying like, you know what, I don't know. This is really hard for me. This is really overwhelming. So that's the piece that we're working on. What we're seeing when we convene people for 1 time, 4 days, or 2 times 3 days is actually like with the right modalities, people are beginning to uncover and name and be a little bit more vulnerable and a little bit more real with each other to both have productive conflict and say like, you know, why are you not showing up at that coordination meeting where I need you so much? Take that courage, but also share like, you know, here's why this is so hard for me, and here's like why I'm barely sleeping because this is so difficult.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I have to say this productive conflict for us is really more avoiding conflict at all costs, and that's what unfortunately happens, which means that a lot of the things grow when we just go around them rather than being able to address at the heart of them in order to be able to move it forward. So, colleagues, friends, I'm going to turn to you now, and I think you would help me with the microphone. Is there any of you who wants to ask a question or make a comment or join us on this conversation? The floor is open. I want to make sure that it's not a one-way traffic. Yes, please.
Hi there, I'm Mark Banzett. I'm the Humanitarian Counselor at Canada's Mission in Geneva. The question I have is, we hear a lot about climate finance and that there's lots of money. In fact, my own government has lots of money for climate finance. And very, very little not only goes to countries experiencing humanitarian crises, but to deal with humanitarian challenges. What I understand is that some of those are structural impediments. How do you use leadership to overcome structural impediments like that one?
Mark, somebody would have thought that we paid you to ask this question because the finance is an important element. Colleagues, who would like to take a stab on it? Because money is an important part, an enabling factor to make it happen. Nimo, you were talking, and Bridget, about the not knowing even where, do you know where to go about this, the money that Mark is referring?
It's really interesting question coming from a donor as well. If the donors don't know, then we don't know. No, but it's a very important conversation to have. And the simple answer for Somalia is actually no. I mean, NGOs, including local actors, wouldn't even know where to begin in accessing the climate financing. And there's a lot of talk about climate financing, climate justice, but that information isn't broken down for people to understand exactly where to go for that money. I think it's related to government relationships. It's down to the Somali government being ready and applying finances through them, but when they're so fragile and they don't have strong institutions, then that money that is absolutely needed to address the impact of climate change and climate shocks, and not having the ability to be able to access it. So it's something that really needs to be, it looks like it's been designed to have even more barriers for those people who are in need. So there needs to be a way to ensure, even if it's not direct through the governments, then maybe there are other intermediates that this financing can be accessed from, so that we're basically saving lives.
Yeah, so Marianne, yeah, Bridget.
Yeah, no, I was really happy you asked the question, and I think it's a very important one, also when we talk about leadership. What I'm not seeing in the big pools of money that are de facto available is that it's very difficult for humanitarian actors, for local actors to be able to access that kind of funding. It comes with a lot of very complicated and very long-term criteria. So when we have funds for anticipatory action, that's not a very big chunk of any fund. But the big pools are more structural, and they come with a lot of different requirements that we, as humanitarian actors, at the moment don't really know how to access. I think from a leadership perspective, it would be very healthy if we had other conversations also with the donor group on how to make that make climate funding available for local communities, for local actors, because they are the ones who need to be acting when the triggers are there. And they are the ones we need to prepare well so that they are able to act when we have triggers. And at the moment, I don't see how that is possible.
Yeah, I want to refer to all of you. There is something I discovered today. There's actually a website hosted by European Union which looks into the climate change declaration and commitment by 25 states, which includes the first report just came out today, but I think it gives some information on the climate change. If I can move to our next question, and I think you had raised your hand earlier on. Please go ahead, if we can get the microphone, please.
I think one of the first things that Kate said is that leaders need to be daring. And I was just wondering if leaders in the humanitarian aid sector want to be daring. Of course, they're not working in silos, they're working with donors and governments and so on. How can they do that? Do they have an enabling environment? And how can they, if they don't, change those actors that they work with? Whether it's donors who think differently, whether it's governments who, think differently and want to maybe resource aid somewhere else, especially in terms of climate change, where it takes long-term development funding as opposed to humanitarian response. So I'm just wondering whether within the enabling environment, can leaders have that safe space?
So Kate, this is a question for you. Is a safe
Yeah.
space, the environment? But also I would add to your question, the question of accountability, because we live in a sector where you can get away with murder, really.
Completely. And thank you so much. I mean, I'm not so worried about leaders feeling safe, to be perfectly frank. And that's a little bit what the courage business is about. I think our leaders at various levels and ourselves, when we've been in leadership positions, have been more preoccupied with our advancement, our career progression, our sense of recognition, and our comfort zones. And I think part of the daringness is to forego those things, to let those things go, to be less worried about your own safe spaces, and to be much braver in the conversation with power. I'm really struck, for example, by Panos's reference to accountability. I actually think accountability could be a superpower for that deviation from normal leadership into much more daring leadership if it were rooted in local communities. Localization for me is not just a methodology or a means or a reception. It is a judge and a jury. And there should be a consequence from that judge and jury. That's the localization about which we should be speaking. And then I think you would see courage and ideas of safe spaces radically transformed. But there's a second localization. Let me use by analogy that seems almost to go unnamed, and let me use this by analogy. You know, there is talk in that localization space of leave no one behind, of course. It's a fantastic construct that has taken hold of so much imagination, and many leaders have used it. What's extraordinary to me is that leave no one behind is completely too narrow a picture when there are those who have been allowed to get so far ahead we don't even see them. Why is it that we are happy to narrate the leave no one behind, the rescue of the localism that's sitting at the forefront of climate change? No one talks about the localism of Wall Street, of Exxon Valdez, the localization of accountability and attached to responsibility. And until we bring those poles together, then I think humanitarianism is part of the problem. By focusing only on the rescue and the wound and the injury, and not taking the same power of concern to those who have made the profit from the wound and the injury, and whose persistence with profit will mean that we are taken to the very brink of human extinction. That's what we're facing, a singularity within a foreseeable period of time because of the silences, our preoccupation with our own sense of safety and security, and our unwillingness to name the full problem. And that's why I think, look, it's okay to feel nervous. Just don't try to lead. If you feel like, please don't lead. No, please just don't do that.
I would love to. Would love to add in one sort of piece, which is different roles in the system have a different risk tolerance, and I think it is helpful if you're practicing leadership to have a little bit of an assessment. What's the risk profile of the role that you're holding? For example, if you're an elected official, your risk tolerance is a little bit lower than if you have if you're not subject to the election cycles. Because if you take a risk that is too big, you may be voted out of office, right? There is an antidote. Some people like Greta, great example as an activist, you have a humongous risk profile because nobody can vote you out, right? You don't have that much to lose. So the antidote here is if you are in a role and many mandate holders, have not the biggest risk profile, qua role, they can get kicked out. The antidote here, or the strategy, is to partner. Really, really strong leadership doesn't mean you need to agitate, you need to provoke, but maybe you have a platform. Maybe you bring in the activists. Maybe you bring in the local leader, the local voice, and offer the platform, and sort of distribute the risk accordingly within the system.
Thanks, Michael. I can see a hand here and at the far end. So I suggest we take two questions together, back to back, and then we'll take them just for the sake of time. If you could please introduce yourself.
I don't have question, but I have comments, opinion from my side. So I am Ruma. I came from Bangladesh, and so I would like to share one areas as like representative from unprivileged society to leader, because it's talk about humanitarian leadership. So from our perspective, we are expecting leader need to be bias free, need to be neutral, need to be non-discriminative, because so many response and crisis we found that it's forgotten due to like every year we have new response, new crisis, but what about the rest of the population? So it's really forgotten by the leaders. So it's really necessary for them to keep in that list. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you for your comment, and particularly coming from the field. It's very much welcome. Thank you. Yeah. The gentleman in the back.
Hello, my name is Patrick Hamadi. I'm a policy advisor to Medica in Germany. I have a question which is slightly pregnant. Looking at the title and what has been shared, we're talking about a fractured world. And when I look at the fractured world, it is increasingly fractured. but there's a sense in which it has certain resets in this fracturedness. That's one. The other thing is the complexity is also increasing because we have talked about interconnectedness, innovation, and so many other things. And I was just wondering, where is the place of humanitarian leadership in this whole theater where we have different resets coming up in the fracturedness that is happening? That's one point, a pregnant question. The other thing is, if we could just hear what are some of the thoughts among think tanks, like Ralph there, what are some of the thoughts from the others? I think it will help my confusion be better. Thanks.
Thank you. Ralph? Yes, yeah, we should take one more question because this is actually the last round of questions and then we'll go through answers. Please
Thank you so much. My name is Ahmed Khalifa. I'm the Country Director for ACF in Somalia. My question is more on the leadership styles and, linking to the earlier discussion around leadership and climate change. Is it more of a leadership problem than a climate crisis? And I wanted to frame on the same. Do you think the golden age of INGO's leadership is over, and do we see a fractured humanitarian leadership rather than a fractured world that drives some of the issues we face? And what leadership style will you say, will you recommend to say to kind of survive through this era?
Thank you. So we have about 6 minutes or so left. There's a couple of questions that have come on the table. So I'm going to start from that end to do a final round of about a minute each. What do you take out of this? What's your one word to answer to the question, but most importantly, focusing on the leadership as we're moving forward? So Michael.
So I want to encourage us all to think about leadership not as a role, not something that you hold or that you're appointed to, but something that you do. Something that you have a choice every single day. Do I lead now? Do I make a move? Do I not make a move? Do I make a move to address the fracturedness in the area of influence that I have today or tomorrow? And kind of this idea of leadership as an activity is something that is really, I think, necessary, particularly for the challenge as big as climate change, because as long as we keep looking at the leaders to fix and solve, it's not going to work out. We all, including us here in this room, we're all holding a piece of the puzzle. And so the courage that is needed from us is something that we can all pick on.
Thank you. All great questions and comments. Thank you for that. For me, I really liked what you said about you don't have to be the one that's taking the risk as a leader, but you can also enable others and use other platforms to get your message across. Because I was thinking about the national leaders when we talked about being courageous. You can be courageous as a national NGO leader against the power holders, and you're done. Those contracts are cancelled, nobody wants to work with you, so you really have to be careful on how you phrase and your wording. So I think it's important that you are identifying other platforms to engage and to get your message across. A climate crisis is real, and it's affecting the vulnerable communities in Somalia, for example, and in the Horn of Africa as a whole. So something needs to be done. Something needs to be done and be done very quickly, so that we are investing in trying to save lives, but also not just about saving lives, but giving people dignity, quality of life. Because when we talk about a 13th family in Somalia recently, it's a word, it's a technical word. People are still dying. Children are dying. So I think if we put ourselves in that mindset and that we try and empathize with empathy of the people that we're trying to serve, then I think we do a better job as leaders, as individuals, as representatives of organizations. So if I was going to leave any thought with you individually and remind myself as well, is that we need to have more empathy and ensure that we're doing whatever space that we have to advance supporting the affected communities that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Wow, this is not so easy. Those are really, really big questions that we have flying around in this air. I would like to, about leadership, I think we all have a part of the puzzle. I very much agree with that. And I would encourage everyone working in humanitarian sector, which I think we all are, to be opening the listening mode when we are in contact with the local communities and the people that are the most affected, because any climate crisis, any climate effect is always hitting the most vulnerable hardest. And therefore we need to be able to listen, to take data, to be smart about what the issues are, and be able to tackle them. So I think this is about turning a little bit from the think tanks, with all respect, and like really big thoughts and weather forecasts is one part of the puzzle. But the other part of the puzzle are the people that are there on the ground in the middle of it. And we need to be able to help them be better prepared for the world that we're in at the moment with climate change as a factor. It's there.
Thank you, Ralph.
Many thanks, Panos. Of course, very hard. If I would need to share one thought, I would try to link it to what has been asked also before, because in many ways I think it comes indeed down to dare, as humanitarians, to dare to come out of the comfort zone, even starting with a debate. It might sound like a bun, but when I wanted to come in, for example, on the question on climate finance, etc., to share an example, I talked to a couple of donors if they want to try to tap now into climate finance, if that could bridge the financial humanitarian gap, if loss and damage could help. And even there on the donor level, we often talk about donors as if it's one body. On the donor level, there has been a hesitance. Well, if we start this debate, well, at the end of the day, the climate guys might overwhelm us and take the humanitarian funding to the climate side instead the other way around. So this lack of self-confidence even to start a debate, plus, of course, this, for good reasons, looking at, well, we are a very specific sector. We have to follow humanitarian principles, neutrality, impartiality. Let's not start a debate about where we could work together, where we need a debate, where we need to come into debates on security issues as they are discussed so much right now, and to lead in this regard what human security would mean in this context, including the climate side, etc. So if I would need to track it down to one point, I think it's to dare to get involved and to be confident where we don't, at the end of the day, the debate, don't want to get involved, to be not politicized, to be not overwhelmed by other actors. We are confident that we can manage and we can protect our sector where it's needed.
Thanks, Ralph. Kate.
Thank you. For me, I think it is about noticing that we all lead in different ways, and there are some of us have leadership roles and titles and power and authority, and others of us create leading influences just through how we live our lives. What has to be clear is the leadership that brought us here is not the leadership that will take us away from here. So that it isn't a question of do we need new leadership or do we need to change leadership. It's the question is how do we change it, and how do we change it rapidly enough. And I would really describe the importance of urgency and clarity that comes with greater urgency. I'd really encourage that. And I still feel, even in a conference like this, the urgency is not proportionate to the crisis in which we are. So that's already saying something about there's not enough courage and leadership. Courage and leadership is not feeling less fear. It's certainly not muscle and might and military action. But nor is it recklessness. That's not courageous leadership, to destroy yourself with a single action. No. But courageous leadership is a willingness to look into the abyss, not to pretend there is no abyss or that we've got years to address the abyss. It is the willingness to walk up to the precipice of the abyss, look down in it, and turn to those behind us and describe what we see. And then to rise to the moral action that comes from that abyss. And it certainly isn't about only narrating the injury, the wound, and the injustice. It is about addressing the absolute, almost comprehensive impunity with which those who caused this have been treated. This is not somehow appearing out of the blue. This has been created. This is man-made. In fact, we even know who those men are. There are only 22 of them who own more wealth than all the women of Africa combined. We know their names and their addresses. Where is the story being told of the accountability of that leadership to those women of Africa? I'm struck, if I might say, that Leonard Cohen in his last song said something very, very important. He said, look out for the cracks. That's where the light gets in. If I say be a crack finder, it has very unfortunate... it has very, very unfortunate connotation. But look out for the cracks. That's where the light will get in.
Colleagues, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, focusing on leadership. At GELI, the Global Executive Leadership Initiative, this is the focus we take, looking at the role of leadership and the multiplying effect it has in operation, leading from the top, the vision, the implementation, the value for money, and the accountability that comes with it. So we'll continue this conversation. I want to point out before closing, we just published today the Leadership and Humanitarian Change, Why More Collaboration and Transformation is Needed. 6 research papers that look into the role of leadership. They're all at the GELI website as well, including a podcast on each of the 6, with many thanks to the German Federal Office for really putting this together in an event in Berlin and now publishing it in terms of where we are here today. So this brings an end to our session. I would like to ask you in joining me in thanking the distinguished panel.